Cosmic True Slasher Review.
Speaking of Dungeons and Dragons,
Yes.
new chapter. I know how big of a fan you guys are. So even before we get into Vecna and all these things that are going on, could you talk a little bit about, because everyone knows how big of a D&D fan you are personally.
Yeah.
What did the importance of this to you, your team?
Look,
Yeah, go for it.
I don't know if you're seeing my camera. I know I'm all alone showing my face in here, but if you do, like, I found those. There were in my library. Can you see those? Oh, you can't see those.
In and out. Yeah.
It's blurry. Just give me a sec. Do not blur. There you go. These are the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons books that I started playing with. They're the 1980 edition, but I got them probably in 83 or something like that. I must have been 8 or 9 at the time. And I kept those. They were actually wrapped in plastic by my mother, who did the same with all of my school books at the time. And so, yeah, I've kept those very preciously. They're sort of an artifact here for me. Yeah, I've been playing vigorously for the last. I mean, there were pauses throughout, but we started again about 9 years ago, I want to say. And my group of friends, we've been playing every Wednesday. Now it's Tuesdays because we had to change, but we've been able to keep playing every week for the last 9 years almost. So yeah, it's a very personal thing for me. It's such a huge part of who I am today and why I do the things that I do, because it forged me in more ways than none. And in the stream, I talked to Sean, our friend from Wizard of the Coast, a little bit, and we touched upon that a little bit. But
Yeah.
To me, it's more than just learning how to craft stories or even get into game design, which is an absolutely important part of all of this. But I think that role-playing games, and I know there were studies done on that, but I can't quote them right now. But role-playing games, at least to me and to the people around me, have been such a great way to build empathy and to build a way to think where you more easily put yourself in other people's shoes, right? And it helps to be able to, that, like I said, to have empathy for other people, because you can imagine being other than what you are. And I think it's an extremely powerful tool for kids to learn how to interact with people. Now I'm getting a little carried away and I rant as I usually do.
No, yeah.
To me, Dungeons and Dragons is not just about like spending a Wednesday night with your friends, but it's also about exploring sort of parts of yourself and yeah, it's just I absolutely love this.
When you were looking through all of the Dungeons and Dragons lore,
Yeah.
how you kind of came to the decision to incorporate Vecna and like what that decision was like. Was it at all impacted by the fact that you've been playing since Advanced Dungeons and Dragons? Because that's like one of the OGs.
It's kind of funny because my boss, Stephen Maroney, who's the VP of Behavior Digital, like he's the guy in charge, and he's probably slightly more knowledgeable about Dungeons and Dragons than I am. Like he is a huge D&D nerd also, and we ended up having some really like silly, like from the outside, silly conversations about characters it could be about and maps and things, because we have so much common shared knowledge, but it went so deep that at some point we were looking at each other going, nobody else knows this shit, right? Like it's fun for us and we're super excited, but all these names we keep dropping, we're sort of just showing off to each other. But like it's pointless. We had to take a step back a little bit and look at things that are a little more classic, a little. I've made a bit more of an imprint on popular culture, something that people would resonate with a little more, because it has to be more than just fan service to the absolute hardcore fans. It has to be accessible. Fortunately, the last, let's say, 2, 3, maybe 4 years, I've seen Dungeons and Dragons take a huge center place in popular culture, right? The whole Critical Role and Dimension 20 and all of these people making podcasts and series of content about role playing, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or other, but mostly Dungeons and Dragons, has really put that front and center in people's minds. The whole Vox Machina series, if you've seen it, it's awesome. The movie that just came out, and then we knew also that there was a big 50th anniversary celebration that was going to happen. So it was sort of a perfect moment to dig into that. Now, to answer more precisely your question, yeah, we did name a couple of other things that we thought would be interesting to do as a Dungeons and Dragons chapter, but I think that going for Vecna was just I don't know. Maybe the history will tell that we should have done something else. Although we never know with these things. But I think it was the great one, because I mean, Vecna has been in some form or another part of Dungeons and Dragons for the last 50 years, literally, right? The Hand of Vecna, the Eye of Vecna, were items talked about 5 decades ago, and Vecna as a character wasn't there, but there were whispers of what he could have been and legends about him, which is absolutely great. So it just lent itself really well to what we were trying to do.
Can I ask one more
Sure.
really hyper specific Dungeons and Dragons question?
Go ahead.
While we're on the, just because while I was, I think a lot of us, a lot of the D&D nerds that are into Dead by Daylight were kind of hoping and brainstorming and had ideas of who could be brought in.
Sure.
I think that Vecna was the right choice, like 100%. I think this is a decision that just is really clever on a lot of levels. Did Strahd ever cross them? Because I just think that the Barovian lore with the mist and the fog is just such a, like,
it would have been great,
easy transition.
but there's a couple of things that made it less of an easy choice. Namely, if you've watched the broadcast, you know that there's a vampire coming.
Castlevania.
Yeah.
Coming, yeah.
So you don't want to step on Dracula's toes, right?
No.
And we wanted to make sure we kept a big sort of separation between those. The other thing also is that the whole Ravenloft storyline, the whole universe, that plane of Ravenloft is not the first thing that comes to mind when people think of Dungeons and Dragons. It's awesome. It's great.
Because Vecna, like, did get transported to Ravenloft, I believe, at one point in the canon. So I think it was a better decision to start with, like, an older D&D character that has that tie-in.
But you touched on a good point too, because Vecna can travel through dimensions, right? He can go other places, and therefore, again, it was another in the prose, another check in that column saying, yes, narratively, it also makes sense to have that character. And if for someone that's just mildly interested in Dungeons and Dragons, having something that's much more dark fantasy, classic, like medieval hero thing, it fits. It requires fewer explanations. So it was actually, one of the first ones we talked about was the Tomb of Horrors, because it's also an absolute classic of Dungeons and Dragons, of course, and it's a cool dungeon. And then that was at the heart of the map. Of course, at the core of that adventure is a Sararak, who's another evil lich, and we thought that was interesting. Also, it's been talked about in the Ready Player One. It's part of at least the book, not the movie. But then the map was the hero, which is usually not something that we do in our chapters. So we moved on from that one. But there were a couple of other options, and that's the thing, right? It's so rich in lore. It could have been many, many, many things. But I think in the end, the bard, with its option of how you want that character to be, and the dark. I don't know what's the final name we gave him. The Lich, I believe. So yeah, I think that's history will prove that we were right in picking that one. It's also something that Wizard of the Coast was very, very excited about, because this was really a collaboration, right? We were all nerding out together and talking together, and they were telling us, well, we intend to release some cool content featuring Vecna and the big 50th anniversary celebration, so it would sort of fit if we were to do that. So yeah, in the end, it was an easy decision.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people forget too, when you guys pick something, or especially when you're getting into IPs, that the part of the goal is for you guys to draw new players in to Dead by Daylight.
Ideally, yeah.
Yeah, and I have seen a little bit of talk. I mean, the reception's been great, but I have seen a little bit of talk of a lot of people saying, "Oh, this doesn't fit," and blah 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 blah. And I think that's absurd. And I wanted you to talk about, first of all, the possibilities of horror within Dungeons and Dragons, but also how important it is to bring different communities in and also mesh that, which is one of your goals.
Yeah, that's a very large question, but yeah, the nature of what is horror and what isn't is a hotly debated subject, right?
Yes.
I think that we've tried many, many different things in Dead by Daylight over the years. We've also realized, I think, with the All Things Wicked, we've shown that we remember what horror can be like, what really classic horror can be like. I think that is by far our most appreciated original chapter in a very, very long time, because it's spooky and it's creepy, and it's not a strange take on horror. It's not a far-fetched vision of it. It's not an interpretation. It's really just smack dab in the middle of it. And in terms of Dungeons and Dragons, again, Sean and I talked about that during the broadcast, but Dungeons and Dragons is mostly a very flexible tool for you to tell stories with your friends, and horror stories will be part of that. Therefore, there's a large portion of Dungeons and Dragons, there's a large portion of the fans for whom horror is not part of Dungeons and Dragons, but there's also a large portion for whom horror is absolutely an intrinsic part of Dungeons and Dragons experience. So it was important for us to go and try to find these things, because telling stories of horror, whether you're telling whatever kind of story you tell, the intensity of the reception, the intensity of the emotions, and the reactions that you get from your audience is really important if you want to make them laugh a lot, if you want to make them cry, if you want to make them scared, like, and so using the tools in the Dungeons and Dragons toolbox, if you will, to create fear can be extremely powerful. And so that's sort of what we looked at, and it's funny because, for instance, Dave, our creative director, for the last 8 years has been saying, no, I don't want any magic in Dead by Daylight. Magic is kind of silly. It's stupid. It's an easy fix when you don't know how to explain shit. Like, he had many rants about magic, right? He didn't want magic, but when we started looking at this, he's like, okay, but we'll make this extremely how did he describe it? It's more than dark. It's like, it's magic that is rooted in something real. It's not just magic missiles conjured up of thin air. It's blood magic, or death magic, necromancy, something that's really much more visceral, and that is very, very closely tied to a lot of different folklore or urban myths throughout all cultures, right? I think that every single culture on Earth has some elements of blood magic or death magic in some form. So that's what we tried to focus on in this chapter specifically. I don't even remember what your question was, Ali. I'm sorry.